Kakaturian sisters. On July 28, 2018, law enforcement detained Christina, Angelina, and Maria Kakaturian, yet no one could have predicted the surge of public outrage that would follow, splitting public opinion in Russia in a way reminiscent of the polarization surrounding the O.J. Simpson case in the United States. The account of the Kakaturian sisters and their father, Mikhail, began in Azerbaijan, where Mikhail was born in 1962 into a traditional Armenian family deeply rooted in the Orthodox Church and the customs of the Caucasus. However, history compelled them to leave their homeland. In February 1988, the Supreme Soviet of the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Region called for unification with the Armenian SSR, an act that triggered protests and unrest in both Azerbaijan and Armenia, leading to ethnic clashes in Baku, forcing Armenians like Mikhail's family to flee from the violence. Mikhail and his relatives escaped to Moscow, intending to move to the United States, but family problems delayed their departure, resulting in their prolonged stay in the Russian capital. There, in 1996, he met Aurelia Dunduk, who became his wife and the mother of his children. However, their marriage was far from happy. Aurelia recounted that Mikhail struck her right before their wedding ceremony, and the abuse continued for 20 years, openly, even before others. The Kakaturians lived in a crowded two-room apartment with Mikhail's mother, sister, and nephew, at times accommodating up to 10 individuals at Mikhail's discretion. To acquaintances and friends, Mikhail appeared devoutly religious, strictly following religious norms and superstitions, enforcing rigid restrictions on his family, particularly on Aurelia, whom he forbade from working and restricted from leaving the house. The patriarchal beliefs maintained by the Kakaturians dictated that Aurelia, as a dutiful wife, should silently endure the beatings. Within this oppressive atmosphere, the family expanded. Aurelia was only 19 when she became pregnant with her first child, Sergei. Christina was born in 1999, followed by Angelina and later Maria in 2001. Sergei was the first to experience Mikhail's harsh behavior, which continued through brutal beatings disguised as discipline. After Sergei was expelled from the home at the age of 16, Aurelia faced a similar outcome in 2015. Mikhail drove her out, forbade her from seeing their daughters. Before I continue, I want to remind you that only a small percentage of people who watch my videos are actually subscribed. So if you enjoy my content, consider subscribing. It's free, and you can always change your mind later. Now let's move on with the video. And threatened to kill her if she attempted to contact them. Terrified, Aurelia kept her distance, fully aware of her husband's violent disposition. For more than 20 years, she endured abuse and turned to the police for help, but her efforts were in vain. In desperation, she even harmed herself with a knife, but still received no aid. With Aurelia and the eldest son gone, Mikhail's violence intensified towards his daughters, burdening them with unbearable tasks, regular beatings and cruel treatment, including forced intimacy. He demanded their constant availability, summoning them with a bell at any hour to serve him, fetching water, food, or whatever he demanded, asserting his dominance and control to the extreme. Furthermore, he subjected them to sexual abuse whenever he chose. Following these events, 2016, Christina, one of the sisters, attempted to take her own life but was resuscitated by doctors. He isolated the girls, negatively affecting their schooling. Maria and Angelina, who were in the same grade, were rarely allowed to attend school in recent years because their father forced them to stay home. The sisters later stated that their father continuously threatened them with different weapons and even installed a surveillance camera to monitor them whenever he was not at home. In a horrifying instance of the psychological torment they endured, he forced them to eat the family dog's hair. Shockingly, all of this took place in the 21st century, right before the eyes of neighbors, teachers, and the girls' friends and parents, all of whom witnessed Mikhail's violent behavior. Yet, apart from the school psychologists who attempted to discuss the family's situation, the community and school staff chose not to intervene, providing no meaningful support, a reaction not uncommon in Russia. In a wider context, in 2017, under pressure from the Russian Orthodox Church and traditionalist groups, the parliament passed the slapping law, which decriminalized domestic violence, reducing it to an administrative offense. Thus, it was hardly surprising when the psychologist's attempt to speak with Mikhail was abruptly ended by threats, as he guarded his family matters with extreme caution. By then, the Kakaturian sisters were virtually imprisoned in their home, enduring their father's physical and psychological abuse. a reality hidden from their mother and brother, but easily inferred from past experiences. Tragically, these abuses were normalized by their grandmother and paternal relatives, who believed Mikhail was protecting his daughters to preserve their honor. On the night of July 27, 2018, after returning home from medical treatment, 57-year-old Mikhail grew furious over excessive expenses and the disorder in the apartment, which he had demanded his daughters maintain. He summoned them one by one, reprimanded them inside a room, and sprayed pepper spray into their faces, causing Christina to lose consciousness from a severe asthma attack. After punishing his daughters, Mikhail lay down to sleep on a couch. At that point, Angelina and Maria decided they could no longer tolerate the abuse. That night, while their father slept on the couch, 18-year-old Angelina quietly approached and struck him in the head with a hammer. Then 17-year-old Maria stabbed him with a sharp household tool that he often used to intimidate them. Despite their efforts, Mikhail, strong as ever, awoke and tried to defend himself and flee the apartment. Hearing the noise, 19-year-old Christina, the eldest sister, grabbed the same can of pepper spray their father had used and sprayed it into his face to prevent him from catching one of her sisters. Amid the violent struggle, Angelina took the sharp weapon from Maria and delivered the final blow to their father, who had tormented them for so many years. Minutes later, the three sisters inflicted cuts on their own arms to simulate defensive wounds, as though their father had attacked them. They then contacted the police and called for an ambulance. When Moscow authorities arrived at the apartment building, they discovered Mikhail's body, with the autopsy report indicating multiple stab wounds, including cuts to the chest and neck. During their search of the residence, police seized numerous weapons owned by Mikhail, including a knife, hammer, crossbow, rifle, 2 air pistols, a traumatic firearm, 16 bullets, and 16 darts. Traumatic weapons, which fire rubber or pepper projectiles, inflict intense pain but are generally not lethal. The following day, Christina, Angelina, and Maria were taken into custody as the main suspects in their father's killing. During interrogation, they admitted to committing the crime, citing years of physical, emotional, and sexual abuse by Mikhail as their motive, which led investigators to record the existence of a hostile personal relationship and prolonged moral suffering caused by the father. On July 29th, the three sisters were charged with murder without aggravating circumstances. Christina, Angelina, and Maria Kakaturian described their father as a sex-obsessed monster who systematically subjected them to cruel and inhumane treatment, using them as slaves for years. During the investigation, they revealed that he had sexually assaulted all three sisters and forced them into incestuous relations against their will. Testimonies from relatives and friends confirmed over 10 cases of sexual violence, and medical examinations verified that the sisters had endured sexual abuse. Maria, the youngest sister, was declared mentally unstable at the time of the incident and was ordered to undergo compulsory psychiatric treatment. On July 30th, 2018, a Moscow court held a pretrial detention hearing, extending their custody for 72 hours. During these proceedings, the charges were elevated from simple murder to murder under the Russian Penal Code, implying a more severe punishment. On July 31st, members of Moscow's Public Monitoring Commission visited the sisters, who reported that their legal rights had been violated following their arrest. They stated that they had not been informed of their rights or provided legal representation during interrogation. At the beginning of August, the investigation continued with weapon examinations and interviews of the sisters' acquaintances. Surveillance footage from the Kakaturian apartment was reviewed, and a reenactment of the crime was carried out. Prosecutors concluded that the sisters acted together, with the youngest, Maria, striking their father at least 35 times with a sharp instrument. However, their defense attorneys argued for their innocence, stressing the constant life-threatening environment created by their father, which left them isolated and hopeless. On August 2nd, a Moscow court extended their pretrial detention by 2 months. 4 days later, the Central Office of the Investigative Committee assumed control of the case. Russia's Human Rights Commissioner considered the court's ruling excessively harsh, prompting the defense to file an appeal. While in custody, the sisters were given the chance to study and receive psychological counseling, providing them with the emotional support their father had long denied them. By mid-August, the investigation officially recognized Mikhail's immoral behavior and confirmed both the psychological and sexual abuse. In early September, a psychiatric evaluation determined that the youngest sister was unaware of her actions, resulting in her transfer to the prison's psychiatric ward. The assessment concluded that the two elder sisters were mentally sound but diagnosed them with battered woman syndrome. Although the court initially rejected their request for house arrest, sisters Maria and Angelina were released from custody by the end of September under restrictions that barred them from using the internet or communicating with certain relatives and media for 3 months. Russian news outlets provided differing interpretations of the case, but uniformly reported that the sisters had suffered prolonged physical and sexual abuse at the hands of their father. As the legal proceedings unfolded, the public gradually learned of the sisters' lifelong torment through reports by journalists. Media organizations published audio recordings and messages from the girls, demonstrating the severe violence inflicted upon them by Mikhail. The defense strategy dismissed any suggestion of premeditated conspiracy, emphasizing instead the impulsive nature of their actions driven by emotional distress. Text messages from Mikhail's phone, shared by the sisters' attorney on social media, revealed him threatening to kill them and coercing them into sexual acts, including a specific message from April 2018 in which he vowed to beat and murder them, accusing them of having sexual relations with a friend and swearing they would die dishonorably. Records from interrogation sessions painted a harrowing picture of long-term psychological, physical, and sexual abuse. A widely shared video showed Mikhail shouting at and striking his daughters, blaming them for the messy state of the apartment, footage he had filmed himself. Meanwhile, the Public Oversight Commission launched an inquiry into local child protection services after the sisters' lawyers alleged these agencies ignored reports about Mikhail from the girls' teachers. Although Mikhail had been repeatedly reported to authorities, police denied receiving such complaints after his death, a fact their mother, Aurelia, attributed to Mikhail's close ties with law enforcement, a claim later confirmed by investigative journalists. Activists pointed out that women in Russia often face long prison sentences for defending themselves against abusers. In the case of the Khachaturian sisters, both legal experts and activists asserted that their actions were taken in self-defense. In a country where domestic violence penalties have been weakened in recent years, victims often find themselves with no other means of protection. Nevertheless, not everyone accepted the sisters' claims of innocence, as conservative elements of Russian society remained skeptical. The teenagers also received little support from their own extended family, with several of Mikhail's relatives defending him, labeling the sisters as liars, and asserting that the alleged domestic abuse was merely a response to their own provocations. These relatives further accused the sisters of killing him for financial gain. Despite the sisters' renunciation of their father's inheritance, their grandmother annulled Christina's apartment registration. Their cousin alleged that the sisters fabricated stories about the beatings to damage their father's reputation. An aunt, Mikhail's sister, insisted there was no proof of sexual abuse, referencing medical examinations that purportedly showed 2 of the sisters were virgins and implying that the third sister had a secret boyfriend. The Khachaturian sisters' case triggered widespread public outrage and became a major topic of discussion on state television. In January, the prosecutor's office confirmed the defense's claims that the sisters had endured continuous beatings, humiliation, threats, and both physical and sexual abuse, which ultimately provoked a defensive reaction. Prosecutors then instructed the investigative committee to reclassify the case from premeditated murder to necessary self-defense. One of the defense attorneys informed the state news agency that this reclassification would likely terminate the criminal proceedings against the sisters, who were facing up to 20 years in prison for premeditated murder. However, in an unexpected turn of events, the same prosecutor who had initially proposed downgrading the case stated in March that the sisters would indeed face premeditated murder charges, without offering any justification for the reversal. On June 14, 2019, the charges were upgraded to premeditated murder, carrying penalties of 8 to 20 years in prison. The prosecution cited the father's violent conduct as the motive for the killing. In response, the defense team appealed directly to the head of the investigative committee, urging that the case be officially recognized as one of self-defense. Investigators requested an extension of the restrictions placed on the sisters, prohibiting them from using the internet, communicating with relatives, or making media statements for another month. This prohibition was extended until July 28 and later prolonged further. The case, which received extensive media attention, sparked widespread protests and rallies in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and other cities, as activists demanded the case be reclassified. The sisters gained backing from numerous public figures, including celebrities and journalists, emphasizing the significant wave of public support and condemnation of the perceived injustice they faced. However, the rally organized in their defense was met with opposition from male activists belonging to a conservative Russian group that regarded the sisters as cold-blooded murderers. 4 individuals were arrested for causing disturbances during the demonstration, 3 of whom were identified as members of the conservative organization. Meanwhile, critics drew attention to the sisters' seemingly carefree images on social media. Initially, mounting public pressure appeared to sway the course of the investigation, leading to a major defense victory on July 11th when the investigative committee announced its intent to posthumously charge Mikhail with torture, sexual abuse, and coercion into sexual acts. Nevertheless, by the end of 2019, despite ample evidence of the father's abusive behavior, the investigative committee reinstated the premeditated murder charges, contending that the attack had been deliberate, as indicated by the sisters' coordination of the assault while their father slept and their alleged preparation of the weapon in advance. The sisters countered that Russian penal law allows for self-defense not only during immediate aggression, but also in ongoing crimes. A 2019 survey found that 47% of Russian women and 33% of Russian men felt the sisters' actions were justified. In early 2020, the Deputy Prosecutor General refused to sign the accusation against the sisters, suggesting the charges should be reclassified as necessary self-defense. Although investigators objected, the General Prosecutor ordered further psychological and psychiatric assessments. By May 13th, additional investigations were completed and the murder charges were re-evaluated. In July, the General Prosecutor approved the indictment, leading to the trial's commencement in Moscow on July 31st. The older sisters, Christina and Angelina, were tried together, while Maria, a minor at the time of the crime, was charged after turning 18. At the trial's start, the prosecution sought a communication ban on the accused for at least 6 months. The sisters were restricted from accessing the internet, speaking to the press, contacting trial participants, and joining public events like demonstrations supporting them. In August 2020, the Moscow City Court approved a jury trial for Christina and Angelina's case. Maria was declared unfit for trial with an expectation that prosecutors would seek medical treatment for her in a separate proceeding. Amid this complex legal situation with 3 accused, 2 separate trials, and conflicting legal opinions, a significant twist occurred. On December 4, 2020, a Moscow court ruled that the investigators' refusal to open a criminal case against Mikhail Khachaturian was unlawful, ordering the initiation of legal proceedings against him. Following this decision, in early February 2021, the Moscow City Court returned Angelina and Christina's case to the prosecutors for a legal reassessment of their father's actions. In March, a posthumous case was opened in a Moscow district court against Mikhail on charges of sexual violence, coercion, and abuse, formally recognizing the sisters as victims. The investigation determined that Mikhail manipulated others through fear, brutality, cruelty, and humiliation, committing both physical and sexual violence and exhibiting a deviant psychological disorder. He was also found to have shared explicit, intimate content involving his daughters. However, the attorney representing the deceased challenged the sexual abuse allegations, arguing that no biological evidence existed and suggesting that the daughters themselves might have sent the explicit material from their father's phone. The lawyer further contended that it was the investigators' obligation to prove Mikhail had transmitted the videos. By May 29, 2022, the inquiry against Mikhail concluded, formally accusing him of sexual assault, physical abuse, and the dissemination of explicit content. The trial uncovered horrifying revelations, including that he had once forced his daughters to dig their own graves, underscoring the extreme physical and psychological suffering he caused them. This development created the possibility of exonerating the 3 sisters. After a prolonged legal struggle, they were officially acknowledged as victims, granting them a faint hope of regaining their freedom as their actions could now be reclassified as self-defense. Nevertheless, a final decision in Mikhail's trial had not yet been issued. As of April 2024, Christina and Angelina remained under house arrest, awaiting the resolution of their father's case. Advocates for women's rights asserted that the sisters should receive psychological rehabilitation instead of imprisonment. The potential dismissal of all charges against the sisters emerged following a new psychiatric evaluation, which determined that they had all been suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder at the time of the crime. While the Khachaturian sisters await their final verdict, their defense attorneys continue to hope that the judiciary will reconsider their case and establish a precedent in Russian law concerning self-defense by victims of abuse. The case has generated extensive public outrage and remained a major subject of discussion on Russian television for months, centering on the death of the abusive father and the Moscow police's criticized inaction despite his ex-wife's prior reports of violence. It was revealed that law enforcement frequently treats domestic violence as a private family matter, providing minimal or no assistance to victims. Moving on to the next case. Melanie Stacy Amaya. Melanie Stacy Amaya was born on February 22, 2002, in the municipality of San Rafael, located in the department of Antioquia, Colombia. Her parents, William Amaya and Maria Leon, were overjoyed at her birth despite their young age. They had long dreamed of having a daughter, and their wish finally came true. Later, the family expanded with the arrival of another girl named Natalie. The two sisters shared a close bond and spent most of their time playing together. From an early age, Melanie displayed a cheerful and lively personality. Her radiant smile was her most distinctive feature, and she was quite playful, often asking her mother for makeup to decorate her dolls. Although her family did not have many financial resources, her parents always managed to provide her with everything she needed. She was among the top students at school and consistently achieved excellent grades. As the years went by, Melanie developed a strong and determined character. She was proud and always wanted to be right in every discussion. However, this never interfered with her close and loving relationship with her mother. Whenever they argued, they would quickly reconcile, share their thoughts, and support one another unconditionally. When Melanie entered her teenage years, her parents amicably separated. Shortly afterward, Maria met a man named Rupin Morales, and the two began a relationship. Eventually, they decided to move in together. Both Melanie and her sister joined them, settling in the Mamercan neighborhood of Medellin. Their relationship with their stepfather was excellent, and they came to see him as a second father. Rupin respected their connection with William, always reminding them that he was there to help raise them, but never wanted to interfere with their bond with their biological father. By the time she turned 16, Melanie had become a very attractive young woman who loved to dress up and attend parties. She had many friends who held her in great affection. Around that time, she discovered her passion for electronic music. She decided that she wanted to become a DJ, and her family supported her completely, even starting to save money to buy her a console. They were confident that whatever she chose to do, she would excel, as she was an exceptionally intelligent girl. However, Melanie never had the chance to make her dreams come true. On Thursday, June 28, 2018, Melanie was getting ready to attend the birthday celebration of her best friend, Isaac. Although they had already celebrated the week before, they were eager to have another party. The event was to take place at a nightclub on Carrera 45, an area known for its lively nightlife. After finishing getting ready, she told her mother that she was leaving. Her mother reminded her to be careful and not to come home too late. They hugged, and Melanie got into her Uber headed to the club, but she never arrived. Isaac showed up at the nightclub and immediately noticed his friend's absence. The techno music was blaring, and the place was packed. He began searching for her everywhere. When he couldn't find her, he began sending her messages, but Melanie did not respond. Isaac assumed she might be with her neighbor and closest friend, Maria Landonio, so he decided to wait until the next day and went on to celebrate his birthday as planned. Meanwhile, Maria woke up at 7 in the morning and noticed that her daughter had not returned home. Her room was exactly as she had left it the night before while getting ready. Feeling worried, Maria started calling her phone, but it was switched off. She thought the battery might have died and assumed Melanie could be staying at a friend's house. Still, it struck her as strange that her daughter had not tried to get in touch. Maria decided to call Isaac, who told her that Melanie had never arrived at the nightclub and might instead be with someone else. Maria then contacted all of her daughter's friends and acquaintances, but no one had seen her and no one knew where she was. Eventually, she spoke with a few friends who claimed that Melanie had been seen outside the club but did not go inside, assuming she might have gone to a different party. Completely desperate, Maria called her ex-husband and delivered the terrible news. He tried to reassure her, saying it was still early and that Melanie might be sleeping over at a friend's house. However, as the afternoon went by and she still did not appear, her parents attempted to file a missing person report at the police station. Since it was a holiday, the officers did not take the situation seriously and advised them to wait longer. Trying to remain calm, her parents convinced themselves that Melanie might have gone to a farm to celebrate the long weekend, possibly without cell phone reception, which could explain the lack of communication. Yet deep down, they both knew that something was wrong. They had a terrible feeling that something bad had happened. Maria, Rupin, and William decided to start their own search, visiting every possible place where Melanie could have been, from the homes of her friends to nearby parks, and even the streets surrounding the nightclubs she often visited. After an exhausting initial search, they decided to print and distribute flyers throughout the city containing a detailed description of the young woman, along with a photograph taken on the night she vanished. In the picture, she was wearing a short blouse, light blue jeans, and white sneakers. Her physical description stated that she was slender, of short stature, with black hair and brown eyes, and had several tattoos: a rose on her chest, a moon on her forearm, and wings on her back. Her most distinctive tattoos included a fish on her right leg covering a motorcycle burn, and another one below her clavicle that read "Crazy Life." She also had a belly button piercing and a peritonitis scar on her abdomen, making her easily identifiable. While handing out flyers to pedestrians and police officers on the street, they made it clear that they were in absolute despair and insisted that the official search should begin immediately. The news spread rapidly, and social media quickly filled with images of Melanie. The weekend was unbearable. Maria could not sleep, spending every moment thinking about her daughter. Finally, early Monday morning, Maria went to the police station to formally report her daughter missing. The case was classified as urgent since Melanie was a minor. Officers checked hospitals and morgues to determine whether anyone named Melanie or matching her physical description had been admitted, but no trace of her was found. Melanie's parents held on to the hope of finding her alive, but as the days passed, her absence became increasingly distressing. Then, the first lead appeared. A witness came forward at the police station to give a statement, claiming to have seen Melanie on the night of June 28th near the El Palmer soccer field. According to the witness, the young woman appeared dirty and beaten, as if she had fallen, and was accompanied by a young man dressed in loose clothing, a cap, and large athletic shoes. Although this testimony helped move the investigation forward, the situation remained difficult as the description of the young man was too vague. Most of her friends dressed in a similar way. However, Maria immediately thought of one person, Miguel Naranjo, her daughter's ex-boyfriend. The 18-year-old had ended his relationship with Melanie 3 months earlier on bad terms. Maria asked her younger daughter to get in touch with him. Miguel insisted he knew nothing about Melanie's disappearance, emphasizing that he had not seen her in weeks. He also expressed deep concern, saying he would be heartbroken if anything had happened to her because he still cared for her deeply. Nevertheless, days later, several testimonies contradicted Miguel's claim, with witnesses reporting that they had seen him and Melanie together at a party that night and that he was heavily intoxicated. Following these statements, the prosecutor's office began to treat Miguel as the main suspect in Melanie's disappearance. Authorities obtained a warrant to search his home, but no evidence of Melanie was found, leaving investigators back at the starting point without the slightest clue about the girl's whereabouts. On July 5th of that same year, Maria woke up filled with anguish, unable to believe that her daughter was still missing. She prayed to God to bring her back, alive or dead, as she could no longer endure the uncertainty. Her prayers were answered, but in the worst possible way. That same day, Maria received a call from an unknown number. On the other end of the line, a voice told her to stop searching for her daughter because she was already in another world and buried in a place called El Calvario. Without giving Maria a chance to ask any questions, the caller instructed her not to reveal their identity to the police, explaining that they had not spoken earlier out of fear. Once the call ended, Maria immediately rushed to the police station. Together with her husband and 2 officers, they set out toward the mountain, while she also informed everyone she knew to assist with the search. They arrived in the El Granizal neighborhood of Medellin, where the mountain was located. The area was vast, with many entrances and dense vegetation. To reach the hill, they had to climb numerous steep stairs and pass through squatter houses, which made the path extremely dangerous. The group decided to divide into several teams to cover the terrain more efficiently. Reuben headed toward a section filled with thick bushes behind one of the houses. The ground was covered in large footprints, as though something or someone had been dragged. Following the trail, he noticed a spot swarming with flies and emitting a strong, foul odor. Grabbing a stick, he began to move the rocks scattered across the ground. When he overturned one of them, he was met with a horrifying sight, a human head. He immediately called the police officers who were searching nearby. At first, they assumed it might be an animal, since carcasses were often dumped in that area. They continued removing rocks and soon spotted traces of blood. Finally, they could clearly make out a face. Though it was completely disfigured, it was unmistakably human. Maria broke down in tears, refusing to believe it was her daughter. Natalie thought it could be another young woman who had also been missing for some time. The entire family was in denial. The officers promptly notified the forensic medicine authorities. When the body was finally unearthed, all doubts were dispelled. Despite the severe mutilation, they were able to recognize the tattoo on the girl's chest. The body was completely naked, the mouth filled with dirt and left open, all teeth broken, and one of the eyes dislodged. There was also something particularly disturbing. The person who buried her had covered the body with calcium oxide. The remains were exhumed by forensic investigators and transferred to the Institute of Legal Medicine and Forensic Sciences. After several hours, experts confirmed that the body was indeed Melanie's. Although her remains bore evidence of multiple forms of violence, the cause of death was determined to be mechanical asphyxia. Because of the advanced state of decomposition, it could not be established whether the young woman had been sexually assaulted, but it was evident that she had been brutally beaten. Her family was devastated. There was no longer any hope of finding her alive, but at least they could now pursue justice against the individual responsible for the horrific act. The media widely reported the discovery, and public attention quickly turned toward Reuben, as many suspected him of involvement since he had found the body while alone. However, the community held different opinions. They knew that Melanie had no enemies, but they suspected who might have wanted to harm her. Everyone was aware that her relationship with Miguel had not ended well, and that he was known to be a rather violent young man. Meanwhile, Miguel continued to send messages to Melanie's relatives, claiming he was deeply distressed by her loss, and that he had done everything possible to find her. But no one believed him anymore, and an enraged mob of neighbors gathered outside his house intending to lynch him. The police took advantage of the situation to take him to the station, stating that they were protecting him, though their real purpose was to question him. His statement was brief. He maintained his innocence and appeared very confident in his words. Since there was no concrete evidence against him, he had to be released. Around the same time, Reuben was cleared of any connection to the crime. There was no indication suggesting he was involved in his stepdaughter's murder. Even with Miguel as the primary suspect, investigators began to closely examine his relationship with Melanie. According to those close to her, the couple had met in 2016, when she was 14 and he was 17. Melanie had organized a party with her best friends and hired a DJ, Miguel. She was immediately captivated by him, and they started dating that same week, later making their relationship official. They went everywhere together, including outings with friends. Everyone liked Miguel. They noticed he was affectionate with Melanie and seemed to care for her deeply. Over the months, he began spending more and more time at her home, eventually becoming part of the family. Maria knew that Miguel had issues with his mother. He had told her that she often beat him and sometimes deprived him of food. Melanie's family cared for him so much that they decided to take him into their home as if he were another son. During the first months of living together, everything seemed perfect, and they were closer than ever. However, with time, the relationship between the two teenagers began to deteriorate. They argued frequently, and Miguel was increasingly upset by Melanie's fondness for dressing in a flirtatious manner. She was so affected by the ongoing tension that she decided to drop out of school and began engaging in behavior she had never shown before, using substances. Maria took some time to realize what was happening and confronted her daughter. Melanie admitted she had only done it a few times and always in Miguel's company. This was how Miguel lost all the trust and respect of the family, and from that point on, the situation worsened even more. The arguments turned violent and physical. Miguel frequently assaulted Melanie, leaving marks on her neck and arms. One day, he beat her so severely that blood splattered across the entire room. Maria tried to intervene to help her daughter, but Melanie begged her not to interfere in their relationship and pleaded to continue living together. Their friends were deeply concerned as they noticed how Melanie's spirit was slowly fading. They saw her cry every day and urged her to leave him. After 2 years of constant ups and downs, on May 23, 2018, the young couple had their final violent altercation. Melanie decided to end things with Miguel for good and threw him out of her house. However, he refused to accept the breakup and began stalking and following her everywhere. Rupin went to the prosecutor's office to report that his stepdaughter was in danger and requested a restraining order. Unfortunately, this precautionary measure was never enforced. In the months that followed, Miguel continued to seek her out, promising that if she gave him another chance, he would change and do things differently. But she never agreed. Thus, without any protection from the authorities, the young woman tried to move on with her life as normally as she could until the tragic events of June 28. After collecting every possible testimony about the couple's relationship, investigators delved into Miguel's criminal background. They discovered that despite his young age, he already had multiple records of domestic violence. Reports showed that he had physically assaulted his mother and siblings. They also found the complaint Rubin had previously filed and the statement of one of Melanie's friends. This young man testified that Miguel had once said that if he ever discovered she was seeing someone else, he would kill her. But that was not the most disturbing revelation. The person who had called Maria finally decided to disclose their identity. It was one of Miguel's relatives who lived with him in a house located very close to where Melanie's body had been found. The relative recounted that on the night of June 29th, they saw Miguel return home around midnight carrying a shovel and wearing shoes covered in mud. Moments later, he started a fire and began burning clothing and makeup items before taking a long shower. With all the gathered evidence, on July 10th of that year, the authorities obtained an arrest warrant for Miguel. He voluntarily surrendered to the police and was charged with aggravated femicide. He denied the accusations and proclaimed his innocence, wearing a strange smile on his face. After 6 months of delaying the judicial process, Miguel chose to enter a plea deal, admitting to the charges that identified him as the perpetrator of the crime in exchange for a reduced sentence. Once the judges accepted the agreement, he began recounting the final hours of Melanie's life. On June 28, 2018, Miguel had seen Melanie at the nightclub where Isaac's birthday celebration was taking place. He approached her to talk, but soon noticed that she was exchanging messages with another man. This provoked uncontrollable jealousy in him. He couldn't bear the thought that she already had someone else. A heated argument ensued, quickly escalating into violence. He struck her hard and threw her to the ground. Then they moved toward a soccer field, where the confrontation continued. At some point during the altercation, Miguel grabbed Melanie by the neck and strangled her until she died. In a fit of rage, he struck her lifeless body multiple times before leaving the scene. He then returned home, where he burned her clothes and personal belongings in an attempt to destroy evidence. In his official statement, Miguel tried to justify his actions by claiming he had been under the influence of drugs. However, his account was vague and inconsistent. He refused to specify where exactly he had killed Melanie or how he had disposed of her body. Investigators concluded that after luring her toward the nearby sports complex, he had likely convinced her to talk privately in the area where he ultimately buried her. There were only 2 undeniable facts. Miguel was guilty of femicide, and his motive was rooted in jealousy and obsession. Psychological evaluations later confirmed that he was a violent, possessive individual with a volatile temperament. They also determined that he was fully aware of his actions at the time of the crime, which meant he was fit to stand trial. On Friday, January 18, 2019, nearly 7 months after Melanie's brutal murder, the first court hearing was held. Miguel was found guilty of aggravated femicide and sentenced to 34 years and 8 months in prison. After the verdict was announced, he issued an apology to Melanie's family and to society before being transferred to a prison in Medellin. While the family expressed satisfaction with the ruling, they all stated firmly that they would never forgive him. In the aftermath of the trial, the family grew closer than ever, united by grief and the pursuit of justice. Melanie's biological father publicly thanked the community through a Facebook post for their unwavering support throughout the investigation and legal process. He wrote that although no sentence could ever bring his daughter back, at least this ruling proved that not all such crimes go unpunished. Yet, a painful truth remained. The authorities had been warned about Miguel's violent nature. Had the restraining order been enforced when first requested, Melanie might still be alive today. Moving on to the next case. Molly Bish. Molly Bish was born on August 2, 1983, in Warren, Massachusetts. She was the youngest of 3 children in the Bish family. Alongside her siblings, Heather and John Jr., Molly was known as a bright, responsible, beloved, and energetic girl. The Bish family originally came from Detroit, Michigan, but they relocated to Massachusetts in pursuit of a better life. Their move was prompted by a disturbing crime that had taken place in their Detroit neighborhood, where a young woman had been abducted on her way home from work and later found murdered. The Bish couple believed that Warren would be a much safer environment to raise their children, and for the next 15 years, that belief seemed justified. Always eager to take on new challenges, Molly accepted a summer job as a lifeguard at Commons Pond in the town of Warren. She was thrilled about the opportunity since it had previously been her brother John Jr.'s position, and he had personally recommended that Molly be given the chance to take his place. Dedicated and determined, Molly wanted to excel in her duties and make her brother proud. On June 26, 2000, her mother, Magi, drove her to the pond for her 7th day of work. Upon arriving at the parking lot, Magi noticed a strange man sitting in a new white car and smoking a cigarette. His presence made her uneasy. She glanced at him, but he did not return her look. Magi accompanied Molly to her lifeguard post and lingered for a few moments, hoping that the man would leave by the time she returned to her car. However, when she got back to the parking area, the stranger was still there. Their eyes met for several seconds, and fearing for Molly's safety, Magi waited inside her car for a few minutes until the man finally drove away. On June 27, 2000, Molly's 8th day on the job, she and her mother stopped at a nearby store shortly before 10 a.m. Molly bought all the supplies she needed for her lifeguard shift. When they reached the secluded pond, surrounded mostly by woods, Magi dropped off her daughter, who hurried toward her station since she was running a little late. Molly reached her post a few minutes later and quickly arranged her chair, towel, and work equipment just after 10 a.m. Swimming lessons were set to begin soon, and she wanted everything to be in place before the children arrived. The beach was officially open, but Molly was alone, and it appeared that everyone else was running late that morning. No houses overlooked the water, and the beach itself was not visible from the road, which ended in a dead-end street. In every direction, there were only trees. Around 10 a.m., Sandra and her children arrived to set up their things, followed by several other families. They looked around for Molly, but could not find her at her station. That morning, Molly had not used her police radio, which was part of her normal routine. Aside from the open first aid kit, there was nothing to suggest that Molly had been doing any activity at her station. Even her shoes were neatly positioned in front of her chair. When the swimming lessons concluded, one of the parents contacted the park commissioner to report Molly's disappearance, as it was unlike her to abandon her post without notice. The park commissioner reached the beach shortly after 11 a.m., and at 11:44, he used his two-way radio to notify the police that the young lifeguard had not appeared. He also inspected her personal belongings that remained at the site. From that moment onward, a series of irregular incidents occurred that raised suspicion. Sometime between noon and the early afternoon, the park commissioner encountered John Jr. at a hardware store, yet for some unexplained reason, he did not mention that Molly had gone missing. Another inconsistency was that the police failed to contact Molly's mother until 1 p.m., nearly 3 hours after Magi had dropped her off at work. According to certain reports, part of the reason for this delay was that some people assumed Molly might have gotten a ride to visit a friend, a logical thought given that she had left all her possessions by her post. Alarmed after receiving the call about her daughter's disappearance, Magi rushed to the pond, where she discovered Molly's sandals, chair, first aid kit, radio, and lunch lying near the shore. However, there was no trace of Molly herself. Hours later, after the disappearance site and any potential evidence had been contaminated by beachgoers, children, dogs, and curious spectators freely wandering the area, police began to realize that their initial conclusions might have been mistaken. The first theory, that Molly had gone off with friends, seemed plausible for a typical teenager, but not for someone as conscientious as she was. Consequently, a second theory took hold, proposing that Molly had drowned in the pond. At the time, this appeared to be the most reasonable explanation. It is important to note that Warren was a small, quiet town where serious crimes were virtually unheard of. With its charming homes and scenic surroundings, it seemed like an ideal and safe place to raise children. In fact, that very belief was what had led the Bish family to move there in the first place. The police investigation began with basic procedures, examining the teenagers' belongings and work equipment, when something unsettling happened. The unknown man became a prime suspect, as multiple witnesses recalled seeing him touch and handle everything within reach at the scene of Molly's disappearance, without wearing gloves or showing any caution. Magi informed the officers that she had noticed a strange man loitering near the pond in the days before the incident. Using this information, the county sheriff's office launched a formal investigation. A local worker also testified that he had seen the same man in the white sedan, though not in the parking area near Molly's worksite. The car, instead, had been parked close to a nearby cemetery connected to the pond by a short path. On the morning of June 27th, the day Molly vanished, a truck was delivering sand for the beach. During the investigation, the truck driver was questioned and stated that he had seen the man parked in the lot just a few minutes before Magi and Molly arrived. Police officers searched the pond and the nearby woods but were unable to locate Molly, though there were no visible signs of a struggle at the scene. Both her family and the police were convinced that she had been abducted. Authorities concentrated their investigation on the unidentified man in the white car. Using the descriptions provided by Magi and two other witnesses, investigators produced and distributed a composite sketch of the man. He was described as having brown hair, dark eyes, and appearing to be around 50 years old, possibly a heavy smoker. Since everyone who had seen him mentioned he always held a cigarette. At the same time, a thorough investigation was initiated, which included reviewing local sex offenders to see if any matched the suspect's description, but no definitive identification was made. The investigation into Molly's disappearance became the largest and most expensive missing person search ever undertaken in Massachusetts. The abduction drew widespread public attention and extensive media coverage. Following Molly's disappearance, her family created a website to spread awareness about the case to a larger audience. They also organized an email campaign to reach as many individuals as possible, and over 30,000 people across the United States received messages regarding her disappearance. In 2001, Magi contacted a renowned forensic sketch artist who agreed to draw a new composite sketch of Molly's abductor. The two met at a small inn, private accommodations found in both rural and urban areas that provide bed and breakfast services at rates lower than nearby hotels. They spent 9 hours discussing details as they worked on the sketch. When it was finished, Magi believed it was highly accurate, except for one minor detail. She asked the artist to update the image to include a cigarette in the man's hand. The following day, when the artist presented the revised version, Magi was certain that the composite perfectly matched the man she had seen. In May 2003, a hunter discovered a blue swimsuit. He immediately contacted the police after realizing that Molly had been wearing a blue swimsuit on the day she went missing. This discovery became a crucial lead, prompting an intense search in the nearby forest. Tracking operations involving various experts continued for several years. Finally, on June 9, 2003, Molly's remains were found a little more than 8 kilometers from her home. Although the official cause of death was never disclosed, it was confirmed that she had been murdered and buried within the thick vegetation on Whiskey Hill. The police persisted in their determined pursuit to identify the individual responsible not only for Molly's abduction, but also for her tragic homicide. However, the case soon went cold. In 2005, a man bearing a strong resemblance to the composite sketch became a suspect in an attempted kidnapping, but no connection could be established between him and Molly's case. In 2007, a registered sex offender was identified after trying to abduct and assault a jogger only a few kilometers from Warren. He also matched the suspect's description, yet no charges were filed, and the reasons for this decision were never disclosed. In 2009, Rodney Stanger, who had recently been convicted of murder, emerged as the prime suspect in Molly's abduction and homicide. He had lived just a few kilometers from the town where Molly resided and moved to Florida shortly after her disappearance. Rodney also drove a white vehicle, frequently fished at Commons Pond, and was an enthusiastic hunter in the same area where Molly's remains were discovered. He also matched the description Molly's mother had provided to authorities of the man she had seen in a white sedan. However, Rodney was never formally charged, as investigators could not prove beyond reasonable doubt that he was responsible for the crime. Following this major setback, the case grew cold once more. In November 2011, a confidential informant cooperating with the Special Operations Unit became the new suspect. The man, identified as Gerald Battistoni, attempted suicide in prison after discovering he was being considered a person of interest in Molly's case. Gerald had lived near the area where the teenager disappeared and possessed an extensive criminal history dating back to the 1980s. His DNA was tested in Texas, where he was serving his sentence, but he died in November 2014 and was never charged with the offense. In June 2016, officials announced that enhanced DNA testing would be conducted on 24 previously unanalyzed samples. A year later, in June 2017, investigators revealed that they had uncovered significant new information in the case. This evidence led them to a campground where the car allegedly used in Molly's abduction was believed to have been buried. Several areas of interest were identified using ground-penetrating radar. The new lead was connected to a suspect who had lived at that campground around the time of Molly's disappearance. At that time, he owned a white vehicle similar to the one witnessed in the pond's parking lot. A witness stated that the man had confessed that something terrible had happened and that he had been in the woods all night when Molly vanished. The same witness also recalled seeing scratches and blood marks on his face. However, the man denied any involvement in the case, and it remains unclear whether investigators discovered any incriminating evidence during the 2017 search. In 2019, new tests were carried out using more advanced forensic technology in the hope of gathering additional data to reassess the evidence. Investigators expressed optimism that the new procedures might finally yield a viable DNA profile and allow the wheels of justice to turn once again for Molly. On June 3, 2021, Worcester County District Attorney Joseph Early revealed that Francis P. Summers Sr. had been identified as a new person of interest in the case. Reports from that time indicated that an arrest was impossible because he had been found deceased in his home 5 years earlier. Nonetheless, the police received a credible lead suggesting Francis's involvement in Molly's disappearance, and since the investigation remains active, authorities have been unable to disclose many details about the evidence against him. His extensive criminal background contributed to his emergence as a suspect. Throughout his life, he had accumulated a lengthy record of offenses and served concurrent prison sentences for multiple assaults against women in the same area where Molly worked. Over the years, police had received numerous tips regarding him, but this time, the information provided in those tips was verifiable and supported by evidence. Francis had been convicted of kidnapping and raping a young woman who had visited his auto repair shop in 1981. He was released on parole in 1998, only 2 years before Molly's disappearance, and he lived not far from the scene where she vanished. He also bore a strong resemblance to the composite sketch of the primary suspect. Sadly, Francis passed away in 2016 without ever being charged in the case, but investigators continue to pursue further information about him. When officials announced the identification of a new suspect, the Bish family participated in several interviews. Molly's older sister, Heather, told a media outlet that she believed investigators were doing everything possible with the information related to the new lead. To determine Francis's possible involvement, authorities traveled to Ohio to obtain a DNA sample from his son, who was serving a federal prison sentence. This would allow forensic analysts to compare it with the deceased suspect's genetic profile. Heather emphasized that an individual like Francis, a convicted sex offender and rapist, should have been listed on the sex offender registry. If that had been the case, investigators might have questioned him much earlier, potentially resolving the case with far less pain for everyone affected. In the same interview, Molly's sister stated that concluding an investigation spanning decades would finally bring peace to their family. Although they will always grieve for Molly, at least they would no longer have to keep searching for the person responsible for her disappearance. Molly Bish's disappearance prompted the largest search effort for a missing person in Massachusetts state history. As of 2023, the case remains unsolved. The family believes they are close to identifying the true perpetrator, though they acknowledge the strong possibility that complete closure may never come. Her killer has not yet been apprehended, but the investigation remains open and ongoing. A $100,000 reward is still being offered for any information that leads to a definitive resolution. Molly's disappearance transformed her parents into determined advocates for child safety, and through their efforts, they hope to prevent other children from falling victim to predators. Moving on to the next case. Rossana Galliano. Rossana Galliano was having dinner with her sister, Monica, in the living room of her home in El Remanso, Exaltación de la Cruz, when her phone rang. It was her husband, José Arce, calling to inform her that he would be late picking up their sons, Geronimo and Nawen, ages 4 and 3. Rossana answered the call but, struggling to hear clearly, stepped into the garden to continue the conversation. As she tried to speak with José, a figure suddenly emerged from the trees, took several steps toward her, and pulled out a firearm. The attacker fired 6 shots, leaving 29-year-old Rossana lying just a few steps from her home, struck by 4 bullets. Rossana Galliano was born in the late 1970s in Buenos Aires, Argentina. She was the youngest of 4 siblings, with 2 brothers, Oscar and Gustavo, and a sister, Monica. Her parents were Reynaldo and Graciela. Details about her childhood and teenage years remain somewhat unclear, though it is known that she completed high school in the late 1990s. During that period, her father, Reynaldo, worked as a mechanic. Early in 2001, José Arce appeared at Reynaldo's workshop. José, born on November 22, 1948, had lived abroad for more than 30 years in countries such as Greece and the United States, where he had even spent 4 years in prison for drug trafficking. Eventually, José returned to Argentina in 1996, possessing 8 properties in an upscale area of Buenos Aires. José and Rossana met when he brought his vintage car to her father's shop for repairs. Despite the significant age difference, they quickly began a romantic relationship. At the time, Rossana was unemployed and rather reserved. José seemed financially secure, but in truth, his wealth came from his mother, Elsa, who still resided in the United States. When 52-year-old José proposed to 22-year-old Rossana, her mother, Graciela, questioned whether he might be too old for her daughter. José insisted that love transcended age. Seeking reassurance, Graciela turned to Rossana, who softly confirmed that she wished to marry him. The couple wed on November 17, 2001, after only 7 months of dating. José claimed that his lively, modern, and intelligent nature had won Rossana's heart. Soon after their marriage, they welcomed a son named Geronimo. However, not long afterward, problems began to surface. José proved to be a controlling and jealous man who frequently demeaned Rossana and her family. His verbal abuse eventually escalated into physical violence, leaving Rossana feeling trapped and frightened. His intimidating demeanor, amplified by his ownership of 2 firearms, allowed him to maintain dominance, a situation Rossana's family knew all too well. It was common for José to flaunt his guns, whether at home when guests visited or while visiting others. On one occasion, while painting the house, Rossana's brother Oscar witnessed José physically assaulting her, telling her to shut up before striking her. On another occasion, her father noticed bruises on Rossana's back, and she simply explained that José had dragged her across the pavement. Despite these hardships, Rossana and José welcomed their second child, and Rossana did everything she could to make the relationship work, hoping to create a stable environment for their children. However, her efforts were continuously undermined by José's temper and demeaning behavior. To make matters worse, José's mother, Elsa, controlled the household from a distance, making decisions about their lives during her brief visits to Argentina. By 2006, Rossana had suffered unbearable abuse and finally reported José for domestic violence. Her family remained mostly unaware of the full extent of what she had endured. Months later, Rossana filed a second complaint, this time including a request for a medical examination due to her injuries. Following that, she confided in her sister, Monica, and the two made a pact to stay in touch whenever anything happened. Monica became her safe haven and support system. Whenever life with José became intolerable, Rossana would take her children and seek refuge at Monica's apartment, though José dictated when they had to return, often accompanied by death threats. At times, he verbally insulted Rossana, criticizing her as a mother. Eventually, she decided to move in with Monica along with her children, while José remained in his home. After some time, Rosanna filed yet another complaint and pursued a divorce, which resulted in a restraining order against Jose. They only met at a neutral property in El Remanso, Exaltación de la Cruz, for child visitation, as mandated by the court. It was there that Rosanna confided in the gardener, Daniel Gonzalez, who lived nearby, was married, and had a daughter. Rumors began to circulate suggesting a secret affair between Rosanna and Daniel, though this was never proven. Jose's threats persisted, and Rosanna even played a voicemail for her brother, Oscar, in which Jose spoke about killing her. In mid-2007, while spending time with friends at a bar, Rosanna met Oscar Lugo. He was 32 years old, lived in Moreno, and worked in a sewing workshop. They immediately connected, exchanged phone numbers, and started dating. Oscar Lugo was old-fashioned, a true gentleman, kind, considerate, and always willing to listen. For 29-year-old Rosanna, who had endured years of turmoil, it felt as though she were rediscovering a part of life she had long lost. Oscar Lugo quickly noticed Rosanna's lack of self-confidence and the fear that lingered within her. By December 2007, he was spending the holidays with her family, even dressing up as Santa Claus to bring joy to her sons. Yet the happiness was overshadowed by Jose, who continued to monitor Rosanna's every move. Aware of her new relationship and distressed by the impending divorce, Jose called Rosanna and offered her a truck if she would end things with Oscar Lugo. She refused, and it was her new partner who stayed by her side at the hospital during one of her severe nervous breakdowns. Running out of options, Jose devised a plan financed by his mother, Elsa. Together, they carefully arranged to hire a hitman, whose identity remains unknown to this day. On January 16, 2008, Rosanna and her sister Monica went to El Remanso to pick up her sons, aged 4 and 3. The handover was delayed by Jose, who came up with various excuses. At 9:15 p.m., Jose called, claiming that Geronimo had a fever and that he would take him to the hospital and bring him back the next day. However, Rosanna insisted on taking the children home herself to care for Geronimo. The call was short, and afterward, she went back inside. Around 9:53 p.m., Rosanna sent a casual text message to Oscar Lugo about their plans for the following day. At 10 p.m., Rosanna and Monica sat down for dinner. At 10:50 p.m., Jose called again, and this time the conversation became a deadly setup. Rosanna stepped outside into the garden for better reception, where a shadowy figure emerged from behind the trees and shot her 4 times with a .45 caliber handgun. Hearing the gunfire, Monica screamed and saw Rosanna stumble and collapse. In panic, Monica tried to call 911 without success, then asked her boyfriend to contact the police. Meanwhile, Oscar Lugo, unaware of what had happened, attempted to reach Rosanna at 11 p.m., and when he couldn't, he tried calling Monica but received no answer. Police investigations later revealed that the shooter had entered through an adjoining vacant lot. A witness reported seeing someone fleeing through a gap in the fence, but couldn't provide a clear description due to the darkness. That night, Jose was questioned and appeared shocked. After requesting legal counsel, he allowed his lawyer to handle the situation and left. The following day, during additional searches, a red sweater was discovered, which Rosanna's relatives believed belonged to Jose, making him the main suspect in their view. The case quickly attracted media attention and shocked the nation, becoming sensational as Jose and his mother publicly proclaimed his innocence while defaming Rosanna, insinuating that she had multiple lovers and that those men should be investigated instead. After the murder, Daniel, the gardener, became withdrawn, refusing to speak to anyone. On the night of Rosanna's funeral, Reynaldo noticed Jose nearby in a truck, watching from a distance without joining the service or offering condolences. Later, Jose's defense shifted focus to Monica, Rosanna's sister and the only witness, attempting to cast suspicion on her by questioning why she had no bloodstains on her clothes and why she ran to get her phone instead of helping her sister. However, this theory lacked evidence. Investigators maintained that the weapon used was too heavy for a woman to handle. One critical detail emphasized by detectives was that anyone familiar with the house knew Rosanna needed to step outside to get a phone signal, demonstrating a high degree of premeditation in the crime. During the course of the investigation, Rosanna's sons were cared for by their father and grandmother, Elsa, while their maternal grandmother, Graciela, was allowed visitation. However, Monica and Oscar were denied visitation rights, as Jose claimed to have serious safety concerns regarding his sons. Despite the legal restrictions, the children expressed their wish to see their Aunt Monica, leading Jose to occasionally permit visits. Monica took advantage of these moments to bring them to a psychologist. Eventually, Graciela was granted visitation privileges, though not custody. In an interview during that period, Jose alleged that Rosana had 4 lovers, all of whom had criminal records. According to Jose, Rosana had intimate relationships with these men to extract information about their illicit activities, which she later used to blackmail them for personal gain. Meanwhile, after receiving threats, Oscar was placed under witness protection in his sister's case, which required him to wear a tracking bracelet and receive police security. As the investigation neared its conclusion, authorities still lacked sufficient evidence to formally charge any of the suspects. However, a crucial development occurred a year after the murder, when Jose was arrested in January 2008, accused of aggravated homicide due to his relationship with the victim, premeditation, and the participation of 2 or more individuals. The preliminary hearings commenced on January 28, 2008. Reynaldo, Graciela, Monica, and Oscar all testified, recounting Jose's repeated threats, violent temperament, and use of firearms to intimidate. Rosana's mother also presented the final text messages her daughter had sent to the prosecutor. After the hearing, Reynaldo stated that, although he felt a heavy emotional weight, he also experienced relief in knowing he had honored his daughter's memory. The next day, Oscar Lugo, Rosana's former partner, testified against Jose, echoing the family's description of his behavior. He revealed that Jose had tried to ruin both his and Rosana's reputations, and that Rosana believed Jose's accusations of her having multiple lovers were meant to discredit her during their divorce proceedings. Jose's attorney dismissed the claims of emotional instability and aggression, asserting that they were merely reflections of Rosana's version of events. On February 7, 2008, a 12-hour investigative session took place, during which Jose's mother traveled from the United States to testify. Meanwhile, a new search at El Romanzo yielded no new findings. By this stage, Rosana's family strongly suspected her mother-in-law's involvement in the conspiracy. Consequently, the lawyer representing Reynaldo and Graciela considered filing for her arrest. In their defense, Jose and his mother's attorney maintained that Jose's mother had testified she purchased the houses for her grandchildren, believing the divorce proceedings would not negatively affect them. They also argued that claims of hostility between Rosana and her mother-in-law were unfounded. The media continued to debate the circumstances surrounding Rosana's death and the growing theory that Jose had orchestrated her murder, possibly with an accomplice. Despite the mounting suspicions, Jose was released on bail and continued caring for his children. Later, the court decided that police protection for Oscar, Rosana's brother who worked as a taxi driver, was no longer necessary. In the early hours of July 5, 2008, Oscar was assaulted by 2 armed men. They beat and threatened him for nearly an hour before abandoning him in a vacant lot, where he was later located thanks to his protected witness tracking bracelet. Although his injuries were not severe, the incident left him deeply traumatized. Amid the pain of losing Rosana and the ongoing custody battle, the family once again found themselves engulfed by fear, a fear that was both tangible and justified. With no convictions and continued intimidation, their plea for justice grew ever more desperate, while the sluggish judicial process proved profoundly discouraging. Years passed, and by 2012, the trial and custody proceedings remained unresolved. For years after the assault, Oscar exercised his visitation rights to take his nephews to play soccer, sharing a heartfelt embrace with the 6- and 7-year-old boys. In April 2013, the oral trial commenced, during which Jose steadfastly maintained his innocence. In May, the proceedings were delayed when Jose suffered a stroke, pushing the delivery of the verdict to November 2013. The judges concluded that the murder had been meticulously premeditated, bearing the hallmarks of organized crime. Both Jose and Elsa were found to have coordinated the timing and location of the killing, fully aware that a phone call would draw Rosana outside, leaving her defenseless. The court determined that financial motives underpinned the crime, as Jose sought to avoid dividing marital property. Jose and Elsa were sentenced to life imprisonment. The ruling was later upheld by the higher court, which emphasized Jose's repeated threats, Rosana's history of domestic abuse, and the overwhelming influence exerted by his mother. The actual perpetrators of the shooting were never identified. In 2015, Jose and Elsa were granted house arrest, Jose for health reasons, and Elsa due to her advanced age, permitting the children to live with them once more. The media continued to follow the children's story for years, during which Monica and Graciela had no contact with them. The boys moved between residences familiar to their father, but estranged from Rosana's side of the family. In the second week of January 2017, the court finally authorized the children to spend a weekend with their maternal grandparents for the very first time. The Galliano family prepared their home with fresh paint, a deep cleaning, and cheerful decorations. They hung balloons and created a colorful welcome banner. Graciela cooked her grandson's favorite meal. That weekend, the Galliano household was once again filled with laughter as the boys played soccer, enjoyed video games, and even asked to sleep beside their grandmother, whom they had not seen for more than 2 years. On November 24, 2018, Jose passed away following another stroke. The event dealt yet another emotional blow to the children, who attended their father's funeral. During the service, they voiced their worries about what would happen to them and their future with their Aunt Monica. She reassured them with calmness and affection, promising to support whatever decision they made. They ultimately chose to live with Monica, who then had to face Elsa to convey the boys' choice. Through these and numerous other moments, it became evident that Monica always acted according to her nephew's wishes, whether they wanted to speak or needed silence. Her main objective was to ensure emotional stability and comfort for the children. In March 2019, Geronimo decided not to transfer schools since he was close to his friends and had 2 years remaining there, so he returned to live with his grandmother Elsa. Meanwhile, Monica pursued custody of the other child. Things appeared to be settling down, but during the final week of November 2019, 87-year-old Elsa was transferred from her home to the hospital, where she passed away on November 30th. The following month, Monica was officially granted custody of Newen. By the end of that year, Geronimo moved in with a friend of his grandmother's. Both brothers continued to require psychological assistance to cope with their trauma, with Geronimo in particular struggling with depression. Their psychologist noted the overwhelming chain of events they had endured by March 2020, just before pandemic restrictions were enforced. The person with whom Geronimo was residing passed away, prompting him to seek refuge once more with his Aunt Monica until October 2020. Upon turning 18, Geronimo rented a small apartment and began living independently, sustained by the income generated from his inherited properties. Monica initiated legal steps to secure her nephew's inheritance, fearing they might otherwise be deprived of their rightful assets. Newen, on the other hand, demonstrated emotional progress thanks to the continued support he received and was encouraged to resume therapy whenever necessary. Moving on to the next case. Dan Elkins. In Yuma, Arizona, on July 4, 1995, dispatchers were startled to receive a frantic call from Yuma Police Lieutenant Dan Elkins. In a panicked voice, Elkins shouted, "Hurry up, hurry. He's shooting guns, he's firing rounds. Hurry up." Moments later, Elkins himself was shot dead. The man he was referring to on the call was none other than Yuma County Sheriff's Deputy Jack Hudson. At the time, Hudson, Elkins, and Department of Public Safety Sergeant Mike Crow were members of a 22-person narcotics task force composed of local, state, and federal officers investigating drug activity in the Yuma area. In the days leading up to the shooting, several members of the task force noticed that key pieces of evidence were disappearing from their office. To identify the culprit, they installed a hidden surveillance camera. On July 4th, Elkins, Crow, and evidence custodian Jim Earhart went to review the footage and were stunned to discover that it showed Hudson stealing from the evidence room. The safes had been forced open, and several offices appeared ransacked. As the three men prepared to leave the building, they unexpectedly encountered Hudson. Without warning, he opened fire with a 9mm handgun. None of the three officers were armed. Though they tried to call for help, assistance arrived too late. Elkins and Crow were killed instantly, while Earhart managed to escape when Hudson's gun jammed. During his emergency call, Elkins had described Hudson as 918, a police code indicating mental instability, suggesting that Hudson may have been suffering from a severe psychological crisis. 37-year-old Hudson was arrested outside the building after attempting to flee and was held on $15.5 million bail. Investigators found 3 guns and a set of evidence room keys in his vehicle. A subsequent search of his home uncovered 40 additional firearms, 25 of which had been stolen from the task force's evidence room, along with drug paraphernalia, $2,700 in cash, illegal substances, radios, binoculars, multiple phones, cassette tapes, and a U.S. Customs badge. In 1997, Hudson was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. For years afterward, he claimed to have no memory of the killings, alleging that he had been under the influence of drugs at the time. He died of natural causes in October 2017 at the age of 59, still serving his sentence. Moving on to the next case. Stephanie Bennett. Stephanie Bennett was born on August 30, 1979, in the small American town of Rocky Mount, Virginia. After her parents divorced when she was a child, Stephanie resided with her mother. Despite the separation, her father lived close by, and Stephanie would visit him almost daily. Later, her father remarried, giving her a stepsister named Diana. After completing high school, Stephanie enrolled at Roanoke College, located about 350 kilometers from her hometown. During her senior year, she met a young man named Walter, and the two began dating. After graduation, the couple broke up but continued to maintain their relationship while living in different cities. Stephanie relocated to Raleigh, North Carolina, with her stepsister Diana and a mutual friend named Emily. The three of them shared an apartment in the Bridgeport residential complex, situated in a calm, quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. Stephanie obtained a job at IBM, while her boyfriend moved to Greenville, South Carolina, to pursue an engineering degree. After living in Raleigh for roughly a year and having recently turned 23, Stephanie, her stepsister, and her friend were preparing to move to new cities. Stephanie planned to relocate to Greenville to live with Walter, and the couple had already begun searching for a home together. In May, Stephanie traveled to Greenville, where she and Walter visited several apartments and selected one that suited them. Upon her return to Raleigh, she discovered that Emily had moved to another city and Diana had left for several days to attend a funeral. On the night of May 20th, Stephanie arrived home from work and spoke on the phone with Walter, who was supposed to fax her the lease for the new apartment so she could sign it. They agreed that Walter would send it the next day when Stephanie could use the fax machine at her office. The following day, Walter was unable to reach her by phone, either at work or at home. After repeated attempts and Stephanie's failure to appear at work, her friends and family grew worried and contacted the authorities. When officers arrived at her apartment, they discovered Stephanie deceased on the bedroom floor. After locating identification documents and confirming through a photograph, they verified that the victim was indeed Stephanie. Investigators observed that a dirty laundry basket beneath Emily's window had been moved, leading them to suspect that the intruder may have entered through that window. Additionally, they found the home phone inside Emily's bedroom closet with its cord severed, implying the killer had hidden there and cut the line to stop the victim from using it. After speaking with Diana, police learned that several belongings were missing from the apartment. The perpetrator had stolen $8 from Stephanie's wallet, 2 recorders, and the laundry basket from her room, presumably to carry the stolen belongings. Forensic specialists discovered DNA evidence on the victim and collected a sample, but it did not correspond to any profiles in the FBI database. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation. Notably, the murder weapon was not located at the scene, suggesting that the killer had taken it. Investigators interviewed other residents of the apartment complex, hoping that someone might have seen the perpetrator. During these conversations, it emerged that for several months, residents had reported a person lurking around and peeping through the complex's windows. The manager was questioned, but the apartment administration was unable to locate the suspect. Remarkably, on at least one occasion, this individual had been seen at Stephanie's window. Furthermore, a few months earlier, an unknown man had attacked a woman jogging near the lake adjacent to the complex. Following that incident, Stephanie became afraid to remain alone in her apartment and wanted to relocate to Greenville as quickly as possible. When investigators examined the complex's surroundings, they came across something strange. In the bushes, they discovered several dozen pairs of women's underwear, later confirmed to belong to Stephanie. Police initially theorized that the killer might have taken them from the apartment, but had later discarded them in the bushes for an unknown reason. However, this theory was soon disproven. It was revealed that a teenage boy living in the neighboring apartment had been sneaking into Stephanie's room to steal her underwear, later throwing them into the bushes. The teenager confessed to this when questioned by the investigators, but denied any involvement in the murder. His DNA did not match the sample recovered from the scene, so he was no longer considered a suspect. Authorities believed that the man who had been spying on women through the apartment windows was the most likely perpetrator of the murder. After interviewing everyone who had seen this man, detectives produced a composite sketch and distributed it through newspapers, but it yielded no success. As part of standard procedure, investigators also checked Stephanie's boyfriend, who voluntarily provided a DNA sample that did not match the killer's. Additionally, at the time of the crime, Walter was several hundred kilometers away and physically could not have been at the scene. Subsequently, police requested all the men living in the complex to voluntarily submit DNA samples. This effort also produced no results. No match was found among the 283 DNA profiles obtained. At this stage, there were no major leads. Detectives then organized surveillance of the apartment complex in hopes of catching the man who had been spying on residents. To their surprise, they succeeded shortly thereafter. On June 3rd, officers observed a man approaching several ground-floor windows and peering into the homes. While standing at one of the windows, the man began to masturbate, prompting the police to arrest him immediately. This individual was identified as Christopher Lee, who had multiple prior convictions for peeping and stalking women, including a 3-year prison sentence for harassment in 2000. Detectives initially believed they had finally captured the killer, but their hopes were soon dashed. Christopher's DNA did not match the sample found on Stephanie's body. He was charged with peeping, but was no longer considered a suspect in the murder. The police continued to work on the case without any meaningful progress. A year later, the lead detective learned about a laboratory in Florida capable of identifying a person's ethnic ancestry through DNA analysis. Although he had reservations about the reliability of this method, he did not wish to overlook any potential lead. He therefore sent the DNA samples of 4 of his colleagues, each of different ethnic backgrounds, as a test. The experts completed the task with 100% accuracy, after which the detective forwarded the killer's DNA from Stephanie's case. The laboratory determined that the DNA belonged to a Caucasian individual, but this revelation did not significantly assist the investigation. In August 2003, the victim's father announced a $100,000 reward for any information that could lead to the killer's capture. Stephanie's mother wrote an open letter that was published in local newspapers, pleading with the public to provide any information that might help identify the suspect. This appeal generated a few new leads, but none produced tangible results. In April 2004, based on numerous witness statements, detectives decided to re-interview all the residents of the apartment complex. They discovered that the man arrested for peeping might not have been the only individual lurking around the complex and looking through residents' windows. Having identified the first man and possessing his photographs, investigators sought to speak again with residents who had reported seeing a man spying in the area. Unfortunately, none of the witnesses had seen his face clearly. He frequently appeared after dark, usually wearing a hood that concealed his head. Some witnesses recalled seeing him without the hood, but could only describe his long hair. Detectives interviewed dozens of people until they finally located someone who had seen this individual near Stephanie Bennett's window before the murder. This witness had previously given a statement to police, but now remembered an additional detail. He had seen the man a few days after the incident, walking his dog near a wooded area behind the residential complex, recognizable by his hoodie. The witness observed the man until he vanished among the trees with his Labrador. It appeared that the witness had either forgotten this detail or had not considered it relevant to the murder. As a result, the police did not have this information during their initial interviews. 2 years after Stephanie's death, detectives realized they should be searching for a man with a Labrador who, since he frequently walked the dog in that area, likely lived nearby. Investigators uncovered an interesting detail. Behind the wooded area where the man had been seen, there was another residential complex. Assuming the dog owner might reside there, the police asked the complex staff whether they knew of a man with a Labrador. They were immediately given the name Drew Planton, a 35-year-old man considered somewhat peculiar by the complex employees. He was described as withdrawn, rarely speaking to others, avoiding eye contact, and consistently wearing loose-fitting clothes, seemingly to keep attention away from himself. During further investigation, detectives spoke with an elderly resident who often observed the happenings around the complex. When informed that they were investigating Stephanie Bennett's murder, she expressed surprise that no arrest had been made, mentioning that boy with the big dog as a familiar figure. Residents had long suspected this man, but had never reported their concerns to the authorities. Drew had since relocated to another part of the city. Detectives attempted to reach him at his new residence, but received no response despite multiple visits at different times. While trying to locate Drew, police interviewed his neighbors, who revealed disturbing information. A woman living in the apartment above his stated that she had seen Drew with a young man shortly after Stephanie's murder, and Drew had reportedly instructed the young man not to speak with the police. This led investigators to suspect that the young man might have been involved in the theft of undergarments from the victim's apartment. Other women had also felt threatened by Drew. They reported seeing him while jogging or in secluded areas, where he would watch them intently or even follow them. Since they could not reach Drew at his home, detectives located his place of employment and approached him there. Drew, who worked as a chemist in a fertilizer production laboratory, denied any knowledge of Stephanie Bennett's murder, which seemed suspicious given his close proximity to the crime scene. Although he was uncooperative, he agreed to meet detectives at his home at a later scheduled time. When they visited his apartment, Drew denied ever walking his dog near Stephanie's complex. Considering the numerous witnesses who had seen him in the area, detectives immediately suspected that he was lying. He also claimed not to wear glasses, contrary to his driver's license information, and witnessed descriptions of a man peering into apartment windows wearing glasses. Predictably, Drew refused to voluntarily provide a DNA sample. The detectives decided to surveil him in hopes of obtaining a DNA sample by other means, but this proved challenging as he left no items behind that could be analyzed in a lab. For example, during lunchtime, he would leave work, sit in his car, and simply stare at a fixed point. Didn't the man eat anything? As a result, detectives were unable to retrieve any object with his DNA. Detectives observed as Drew discarded an empty water bottle into a trash container. They retrieved it and took it to the laboratory. However, the experts were unable to obtain a DNA sample from it. According to one account, Drew deliberately took a clean bottle and threw it away on the street, knowing he was under surveillance. After that, the police decided to try and obtain his trash, but they also failed in this endeavor. For several days, they never saw him take out the trash. Notably, the man's neighbors also couldn't recall ever seeing him with a trash bag. Later, the investigators sought assistance from Drew's boss. She agreed to help them obtain an item from his workplace that might contain his DNA. She observed him for several days, but was never able to retrieve any object. Drew rarely ate at work, never discarded anything, and not a single hair could be found in his office. Given that the man had long hair, this seemed odd. The investigators were already convinced that Drew was meticulously eliminating any traces, so they couldn't obtain his DNA. Once, the boss saw him pick up his hair and tie it with an elastic band. After that, he meticulously picked up any strands that had fallen to the floor. Then the woman decided to invite him to lunch at a cafe to supposedly discuss some work matters. But even there, the man was extremely cautious. Eating mostly with his hands, he stored all used napkins in his pocket and even took the straw and the glass with his drink. For dessert, he ordered banana pudding, and Drew finally used a fork. However, after using it, he cleaned the fork with a damp napkin for 15 minutes, eliminating any possibility of obtaining a DNA sample from the utensil. Despite this, the investigators took the fork and brought it to the laboratory. The experts were able to find small DNA samples that showed a partial match with the DNA at the crime scene of Stephanie Bennett. However, the result was too inconclusive as more biological material was needed for a complete comparison. In the end, the detectives obtained a search warrant for Drew's workplace, hoping to find an item containing his DNA. The investigators were also concerned that the man might flee once he realized they were executing the search warrant, so they decided to conduct it at night. Among the suspect's belongings, they found gloves he was supposed to use while working with chemicals. The detectives suspected that his DNA might be inside the gloves, so they took them and replaced them with another pair. They still feared that Drew might flee if he realized the police had his DNA. Experts found biological material inside the gloves, and the DNA analysis showed a complete match. Finally, the detectives were confident that Drew was responsible for the murder of Stephanie Bennett and had undeniable evidence in their hands. On October 18, 2005, police discreetly surrounded the laboratory where the man was employed and waited for him to come outside. Investigators feared that attempting to apprehend him inside the building might result in him taking a co-worker hostage or launching an attack. These fears proved to be justified, as when the man exited the building, officers immediately arrested him. They discovered a loaded firearm in his possession, suggesting that he was fully aware the police were closing in on him and had no intention of surrendering without resistance. During the interrogation, which lasted over 6 hours, Drew remained completely silent, refused food and water, and barely moved. Eventually, detectives had to use a wheelchair to transport him. With a search warrant for his apartment, investigators uncovered a collection of stolen clothing that belonged to Stephanie. In addition, they found 9 pistols, 2 rifles, 40 knives, a pair of handcuffs, and a machete. They also discovered lockpicking tools and another set of handcuffs. Among his possessions was a notebook containing dozens of women's names, which detectives immediately began to trace to ensure those individuals' safety. It was soon revealed that one of the women listed was the same resident of his apartment complex who had filed a complaint about Drew during questioning. She reported that the man had watched her on the street and made her feel persistently uncomfortable. Her fears were validated when police discovered her underwear and tampons inside Drew's residence. Furthermore, they found a copy of her high school graduation videotape. It turned out that Drew had broken into her apartment, taken the tape, made a duplicate, and returned the original. He had kept these items the entire time, even after moving to another location. Investigators also found a check issued to a woman who had been murdered in 1999. They learned that at that time, Drew had been living in the same city. Additionally, the woman had been killed with a firearm of a rare caliber, precisely the same type found among Drew's weapons during the search, making him a suspect in that case as well. However, he first had to face trial for the murder of Stephanie Bennett. 1 month after his arrest, prosecutors officially declared their intention to pursue the death penalty. The trial was scheduled to begin the following year, and Drew spent that period in solitary confinement. Yet, the trial ultimately never took place. On January 1, 2006, Drew was discovered dead in his cell despite all the precautions that had been implemented. Investigators had no doubt that Drew was responsible for Stephanie Bennett's murder. However, after searching his home, an inevitable question arose. How many other victims might this man have had? At the very least, it was highly probable that he had also been behind the killing of a woman in 1999. Detectives were almost certain that Drew had been involved in additional crimes as well. After thoroughly examining his background, the police uncovered several significant details. Drew had grown up in a 2-parent household with 3 siblings. His father frequently humiliated and beat the children until their mother eventually fled with them to another state. As a result, Drew became an extremely introverted teenager, a characteristic that only intensified with age. Nonetheless, he obtained a good education and secured a respectable position as a chemist. His colleagues described him as highly intelligent, though nearly devoid of social abilities. He had no friends, rarely spoke to anyone at work, and consistently tried to distance himself from others. Interestingly, Drew's biological brother also had a criminal record. He had secretly filmed women using a hidden camera and received a suspended sentence. In 2008, Drew's mother filed a lawsuit against the state government, accusing the authorities of negligence in allowing her son's death to occur. However, the judge ruled that the prison guards had taken every necessary precaution and could not have prevented the incident. Stephanie Bennett's father also attempted to sue the management of the apartment complex for disregarding residents' reports about a man spying on them and for failing to ensure adequate safety measures on the premises. According to him, there was insufficient lighting around the buildings at night, making it easy for anyone to move about unnoticed. He also discovered that the window of his daughter's apartment had been broken, yet the complex's management had been slow to repair it, despite it being their direct responsibility. In the end, however, he withdrew his allegations without providing any explanation for his decision. Thus, this intricate and disturbing case was finally brought to a close. To this day, the police still wonder how many other victims Drew may have had. The available evidence indicates that he had a tendency towards serial offending. Yet, following his death, it became virtually impossible to uncover the full truth. Moving on to the next case. The Petit family case. The Petit family was widely regarded as an ideal household, embodying the highest standards with their stable financial situation and exemplary children. They were genuinely respected and admired by everyone who knew them. The father, William Petit, was born and raised in Connecticut and excelled in nearly every sport during high school, particularly in basketball, where he naturally emerged as a leader. In addition to his athletic talent, he was also the most academically gifted student in his class, as demonstrated by his completion of a law degree at Dartmouth University. However, his true passion was not law. He longed to help others, care for the ill, and contribute to a better world. Therefore, after earning his degree, he chose to pursue a career in medicine at the University of Pittsburgh. During his third year of residency at the Children's Hospital of Pittsburgh, William met Jennifer Hawk, a nurse in the oncology department and co-director of a pre-graduate internship health center. They soon fell in love, and those who knew them said they were perfectly matched. The couple married in 1985. For years later, they welcomed their first daughter, Haley, and the joy of her birth inspired them to expand their family, prompting them to purchase a home in Cheshire, Connecticut. On November 17, 1995, their second daughter, Michaela, was born. After recovering from childbirth, Jennifer returned to her work as a nurse and internship co-director. Unfortunately, she was later diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, an incurable condition that she bravely battled for the remainder of her life. Through it all, her family's unwavering support never diminished. At the age of 10, their eldest daughter began raising funds for the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, a cause that would generate considerable donations over the years. Michaela also excelled in her studies and planned to continue the fundraising work once her sister left for college, ensuring the family's charitable efforts would go on. That summer, she had been learning to cook and delighted in preparing meals for her loved ones. Tragically, this simple family activity would lead to a deadly encounter with their attackers. One July night in 2007, Michaela was preparing dinner but realized she needed a few more ingredients for her recipe. She and her mother decided to visit the nearest market to buy them. At that same store was Joshua Komisarjevsky, who had recently been released from prison. Komisarjevsky's upbringing had been turbulent and deeply troubled. Born to teenage parents, he was placed for adoption a week after his birth and taken in by the Komisarjevsky family. Renowned in Europe for their artistic background, they were also deeply religious and extremely strict with him. Despite possessing a high IQ, he struggled academically, leading his adoptive parents to homeschool him. During his trial, he claimed to have been sexually abused by a cousin during childhood, but his family allegedly chose to keep the matter hidden. This experience contributed to the development of a defiant and chaotic personality. By the age of 14, Joshua Komisarjevsky had already been accused of molesting his sister, and around the same time, he committed his first burglary, marking the beginning of his criminal career as a thief. In 2002, he was arrested for the first time on 18 counts of burglary and theft and was later sentenced to 9 years in prison. During the trial, he made a disturbing remark stating, "I like to listen to people while they sleep. I like the feeling of invading their privacy and security." He was released on parole in 2007 at the age of 27. Officials responsible for his supervision considered him a threat to society, describing him as a calculating criminal with deviant tendencies. However, the jury ignored these warnings and deemed Joshua apparently suitable for release. After his release, he resided in a halfway house for former inmates, where he met his accomplice, Stephen Hayes. Hayes had spent most of his life behind bars, having first been imprisoned in 1980 at the age of 16. Over the years, he had been repeatedly arrested for violent robberies and burglaries. He was sentenced again in 2004 and released on parole in 2006, which brought him to the same halfway house where he met Komisarjevsky. Returning to the night of July 22, 2007, Michaela Petit was preparing dinner for her family when she realized she was missing a few ingredients for her recipe. She asked her mother to accompany her to the nearest market to buy what she needed. Unbeknownst to them, they were being watched by Komisarjevsky, who carefully observed every detail: the make and model of their vehicle, their faces, and Michaela's blonde hair. After finishing their shopping, the Petit family returned home, unaware that they were being followed. Shortly after, Hayes sent a text message to Komisarjevsky that read, "I'm chomping at the bit to get started. Meet at Margarita soon." Hayes then sent another message asking, "We still on?" Komisarjevsky replied, "Yes." Hayes's next message asked, "Soon?" to which Komisarjevsky responded, "I'm putting the kid to bed, hold your horses." Hayes replied, "Dude, the horses want to get loose." Komisarjevsky discreetly followed the family in his car, memorizing the precise location of their house before eventually leaving the area. The family then sat down to enjoy what appeared to be a calm, ordinary dinner, completely unaware that it would be their final evening together. In the early hours, while everyone slept except for the father, William Petit, who had dozed off in the living room, their tranquility was broken by unfamiliar sounds inside the house. The next thing William recalled was a fog of grogginess, pain, and an incapacity to form clear thoughts. Komisarjevsky and Hayes had entered through an unlocked door, intending at first to rob the family. However, the night turned tragic. They discovered a baseball bat in the house and used it to strike William repeatedly, who remained conscious despite the blows. He overheard one of the intruders say, "If he moves, shoot him." William was then bound with zip ties and ropes, rendered immobile, and tied to a pole in the basement. The intruders then went upstairs to locate Haley's room, where she lay asleep. Haley and Michaela Petit were bound by their hands and feet to their bedposts, their heads covered with pillowcases. Meanwhile, in the master bedroom, Jennifer Petit had been sleeping. The intruders entered quietly and woke her, and without much effort they bound her hands and feet as well. Feeling in control of the house, the attackers calmly surveyed the rooms, even smoking cigarettes in the living room. After gathering jewelry, cash, and other valuables, they decided to leave. It seemed the nightmare was over for the Petit family as they heard the burglars depart. Yet their torment was far from finished. After fencing the stolen goods at a pawn shop and discovering they had received less money than anticipated, the ex-convicts, driven by greed, opted to return to the house. They found a check register showing $40,000 and resolved to steal $15,000. Surveillance footage showed they had also stopped to fill a couple of gasoline cans before coming back. Back at the house, they revealed their plan to Jennifer, threatening to kill her entire family if she did not cooperate. Desperate and fearing for her children, Jennifer agreed to accompany Stephen to the bank the next morning. Meanwhile, Joshua took advantage of Jennifer's absence to enter Michaela's room, untie her, and begin undressing her. He photographed her with his cell phone and assaulted her, recording the attack. Afterward, he took her to the bathroom to clean her, attempting to remove any DNA evidence, then ordered her to put her pajamas back on and tied her up again. Evidence that Komisarjevsky raped Michaela came from her autopsy, during which state medical examiner Dr. Wayne Carver identified his DNA on her body. At the bank, everything initially appeared to proceed as instructed, but Stephen failed to notice what Jennifer did while inside the car. Before approaching the teller, she wrote a note on a flyer pleading for help. The note read, "My name is Jennifer Hawk Petit. I need to withdraw $15,000 from my savings account. My family is in danger. Please call the police or they will be killed." The teller chose to give her the money, even though Jennifer lacked any identification. With the cash in hand, Jennifer left the bank to return to the car with her captor, while the bank employee immediately contacted the police to report the situation. The manager informed the 911 dispatcher that Hawk Petit had stated the intruders were being nice, and that she believed they only wanted money. The Cheshire police responded to the bank's report by evaluating the situation and establishing a vehicle perimeter without exposing their presence. Now aware of the unfolding events, the officers observed from a distance but did not intervene. Back at the house, Joshua told his accomplice what he had done to Michaela, suggesting that he could do the same to Jennifer. Without hesitation, Stephen overpowered Jennifer, pinned her to the floor, and began undressing her. William could hear his wife being attacked upstairs. He shouted and heard one of the invaders respond, "Don't worry, it's all going to be over in a couple of minutes." Meanwhile, regaining consciousness and hearing his wife's screams, William managed to free himself, crawl to the basement stairs, and eventually reach the backyard. He later stated, "I thought it's now or never," explaining that at that moment he believed they were going to kill them all. Moments later, Joshua went to check on William, only to discover he had escaped. Hayes confessed that while he was raping Hawk Petit on the living room floor, Komisarjevsky entered and told him William had gotten away. Upon hearing this, Stephen strangled Jennifer to death while continuing to assault her. Shortly after, they heard William calling for help. His neighbor, who initially did not recognize him due to his injuries, immediately called 911. Realizing the police would soon arrive, the intruders decided to destroy all evidence. Hayes and Komisarjevsky poured gasoline over Jennifer's lifeless body and around parts of the house, including the daughter's bedrooms and the girls themselves. Investigators later detected the accelerant on the Petit sisters' beds and clothing. Hayes and Komisarjevsky then ignited the fire and fled the scene, unaware that authorities had already sealed off the area a few miles away. Within 5 minutes, they collided with a police vehicle. Surrounded by officers, the two perpetrators were pulled from their car and arrested, quickly identified as ex-convicts. Meanwhile, the fire inside the Petit home was rapidly spreading. An ambulance arrived and transported the severely injured father, Dr. William Petit, to the nearest hospital. Shortly after, firefighters arrived to battle the blaze, and upon extinguishing it, they uncovered a horrifying scene within the remains of the house. The first body they discovered was Jennifer's, completely burned, with remnants of rope still around her ankles. Upon reaching the second floor, they found Michaela tied to her bed, her body completely consumed by flames. Haley, remarkably, had managed to free herself from her restraints and tried to escape, but collapsed only a few meters away after inhaling too much smoke. William had managed to free himself from his bindings, escape the house, and crawl into a neighbor's yard for help. The neighbor initially failed to recognize him due to the extent of his injuries. Both Hayes and Komisarjevsky confessed to the murders. Detectives later testified that Hayes smelled strongly of gasoline throughout her interrogation. Each perpetrator accused the other of being the instigator and true mastermind behind the attack. Komisarjevsky even placed blame on William for the deaths. In his diary, later presented as evidence, Komisarjevsky described William as a coward and claimed that he could have saved his family if he had wanted to. Stephen Hayes's trial began on September 13, 2010, before a jury composed of 7 women and 5 men. The defense argued that Joshua Komisarjevsky was the mastermind behind the crime and responsible for its escalation into extreme violence, while prosecutors maintained that both Hayes and Komisarjevsky shared equal culpability. On October 5th, after about 5 hours of deliberation, the jury found Hayes guilty. The sentencing phase began on October 18th, during which the jury was initially divided on whether to recommend life imprisonment or the death penalty. Hayes's defense contended that life without parole would serve as a harsher punishment. On November 8th, the jury recommended the death penalty for Hayes on each of the 6 capital felony counts. Hayes had previously attempted to secure a plea deal for life imprisonment, but prosecutors pursued the death sentence instead. Dr. William Petit, the sole survivor, commented on the verdict, and the Connecticut State Judicial Branch offered post-traumatic stress counseling to jurors due to the distressing nature of the case. For the first time in state history, the Connecticut State Judicial Branch extended post-traumatic stress support to jurors who had served for 2 months on the triple murder trial, as they had been required to view graphic images and hear gruesome testimony. On December 2, 2010, Hayes apologized for the pain and suffering he had inflicted on the Petit family and expressed remorse before Judge John Blue imposed 6 death sentences and an additional 106 years for other offenses. However, in August 2015, Hayes's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment following Connecticut's abolition of capital punishment. Joshua Komisarjevsky's trial commenced on September 19, 2011. His attorneys proposed a guilty plea in exchange for a life sentence, but prosecutors pursued the death penalty, arguing that Komisarjevsky was a calculating man, not merely influenced by Hayes. Komisarjevsky was found guilty on October 13, 2011, and the jury recommended the death penalty on December 9, 2011. During his sentencing, Komisarjevsky expressed remorse and shame for the pain his crimes had caused, insisting that he never intended to kill anyone. Judge Blue scheduled July 20, 2012, as Komisarjevsky's execution date, reaffirming his responsibility for the murders. However, like Hayes, Komisarjevsky's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment in August 2015, after Connecticut abolished the death penalty. The trials and subsequent sentencing of Hayes and Komisarjevsky marked a grim and defining chapter in Connecticut's legal history. The sheer brutality of the crimes and the emotional toll the proceedings took on everyone involved, including the jurors, underscored the immense challenges faced by the justice system when addressing crimes of such horrific magnitude. Dr. Petit's statements during the proceedings highlighted the enduring pain the murders left on the surviving family members and the community, which continues to commemorate the victim's memory. The sole survivor, Dr. William Petit, was released from the hospital 4 days after his admission so that he could attend the funeral of his family, burdened by guilt and the anguish of survival. He later founded a charitable organization to support children and young victims of violence, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars. Eventually, as a member of the Republican Party, he entered politics and was elected as a state representative. The murders of the Petit family left a profound mark on the community, which continues to gather annually to honor their memory. Yet, questions still persist among family members and the public regarding whether law enforcement handled the situation appropriately. The time officers spent monitoring the house from a distance may have been the critical window that could have changed the course of that tragic night. Moving on to the next case. Tom Coleman. In 1999, Tom Coleman received the Texas Department of Public Safety's Outstanding Lawman of the Year award. Between January 1998 and July 1999, in the small Texas town of Tulia, Coleman operated undercover as part of a narcotics task force. During this period, he arrested 46 individuals who were later convicted on felony drug charges. Remarkably, 39 of those arrested were black. All of them pleaded guilty and received sentences of up to 90 years in prison. The first to stand trial was a man named Joe Moore. Moore was portrayed as Tulia's drug kingpin, yet he lived in a dilapidated shack and drove an old, barely functioning car. Despite Coleman's accusations, Joe insisted he had never sold cocaine to him and maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings. Coleman would later gain notoriety for his complete lack of tangible evidence. He never wore a recording device, never documented his alleged drug transactions on tape, and did not even keep a proper notebook. Instead, he jotted names and dates on his leg. Even more strikingly, none of the individuals arrested by Coleman were found with drugs, paraphernalia, weapons, or significant sums of cash in their possession when searched. In every single case, there was no physical or corroborating evidence. It was purely Coleman's word against the defendants. Joe Moore, for example, was accused of selling cocaine to Coleman within 1,000 feet of a school. Although Joe had 2 felony convictions from his youth, his criminal record since then was minimal. He trusted that the justice system would recognize his innocence and never stopped asserting it. Unfortunately, a predominantly white jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to 99 years in prison. The local community and media celebrated the conviction, convinced that Coleman was cleaning up the streets and eliminating scum. He was hailed as a local hero. Month after month, Tulia residents watched as one alleged criminal after another was locked away. Even first-time offenders, like 22-year-old Freddie Brookins, received no leniency. Freddie was charged with a single count of drug delivery and sentenced to 27 years in prison, despite there being no evidence beyond Coleman's testimony. However, Coleman's credibility began to crumble. He frequently mixed up dates and times, and suspicion grew when several defendants produced undeniable alibis proving they were nowhere near Coleman when he claimed they were. One man was at work, while a woman accused of selling cocaine was found to have been in Oklahoma on the date of the alleged exchange. The prosecution, attempting to preserve its own legitimacy as well as Coleman's, quietly dropped problematic cases. Over time, some residents began to see through Coleman's facade, finding his behavior questionable, though they still needed concrete proof. A rancher named Gary Gardner and Reverend Alan Bean decided they would be the ones to seek out the truth. They could not comprehend how a small town of 5,000 people could supposedly contain 46 drug dealers. Who were these individuals selling to? Before long, outsiders, including journalists and organizations such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, began to take notice of the glaring inconsistencies within Coleman's investigations. A criminal attorney named Jeff Blackburn also became involved in the peculiar case, and soon uncovered that Coleman was far from the lone Texas Ranger hero he had portrayed himself to be. It was eventually revealed that Coleman harbored racist tendencies, frequently using slurs in the presence of colleagues, though he maintained that race played no role in his arrests despite the overwhelming number of black individuals among them. Further investigation exposed that Coleman, at the time he was hired by Swisher County as a deputy, had actually been under indictment for stealing $6,700 from merchants in Cochran County, where he had previously worked as a sheriff. He had also been fired from his position in Ellis County following accusations of sexual harassment. Attorney Jeff Blackburn filed appeals on behalf of the wrongfully convicted Tulia residents, further contributing to the collapse of Coleman's credibility. Eventually, the deputy himself was indicted on perjury charges and faced the prospect of his own criminal trial. 35 of the 38 people imprisoned were pardoned by the governor in 2003, and a total of $5.9 million was distributed as part of a settlement. Joe Moore received over $250,000 in compensation for his suffering. He later purchased a pig farm with the assistance of a retired preacher and a former real estate agent before passing away from a heart attack in 2008. Meanwhile, Tom Coleman was tried for perjury, found guilty, and sentenced to 10 years of probation, though he served no prison time. In an interview, he continued to defend his actions, stating, quote, "They were pissed off at me because all the blacks went to jail and I was the cause of all this misery. Well, I wouldn't have been the cause of all this misery if they hadn't sold me dope. I'm not an angel. I'll own up to anything I did wrong, but I sure as hell won't own up to anything I didn't do." Moving on to the next case. Vanzito Gums. In November 2020, the Department of Justice announced that a former Georgia police officer named Vanzito Gums had been convicted on gang-related charges. Those who knew him were stunned by the revelation. At the time, 28-year-old Gums was serving as a DeKalb County police officer when it was revealed that he had claimed to be a hitman for the Gangster Disciples, a U.S. gang originating in Chicago, Illinois. Investigators alleged that he had passed along sensitive law enforcement information to gang members and had even supplied them with weapons. The Gangster Disciples criminal organization dates back to the 1970s and is described by authorities as being highly organized. It is said to operate under a leadership hierarchy referred to as the positions of authority. Moreover, the gang adheres to a strict set of rules, with silence and secrecy regarded as the most critical. It forbids its members from cooperating with law enforcement, and these rules are enforced so severely that anyone who violates them may face death as punishment. Between 2011 and 2014, the group was held responsible for 24 shootings and 12 murders. Gums had barely finished high school when he enlisted in the military, hoping to support his pregnant girlfriend by serving in the Middle East. He was only 20 years old when he was deployed overseas, where he delivered supplies to troops stationed on the front lines. According to his mother, Janelle, Gums was involved in firefights and carried out actions he later regretted, adding that these experiences haunted him after his return home. In 2013, once back in the United States, he joined the DeKalb County Police Department, though he was reportedly struggling deeply with his mental health. His mother claimed that prior to his arrest, he had stopped eating and sleeping properly and had turned to alcohol in an effort to cope with his mental distress. Although his family and friends urged him to seek help, by the time he arranged an appointment with the Department of Veterans Affairs, it was already too late. He was arrested the day before his scheduled meeting. During the investigation, prosecutors determined that the 28-year-old had joined or continued to associate with the gang despite knowing and accepting that it engaged in murder. Additionally, in 2015, he sent a text message that read, "I'm a GD hitman." At that time, Gums was under FBI surveillance, as agents suspected his involvement with the Gangster Disciples. While investigators believed that GD referred to the gang's name, its common abbreviation, Gums insisted that the initials stood for "goddamn," telling his attorney that he had been referencing his military service. His lawyer suggested that Gums was likely trying to impress the woman to whom he had sent the message. In 2019, Gums was accused of assaulting a man while on duty in 2015. According to the victim, Gums had mistaken him for a rival gang member. The victim's attorney stated, "At the time he assaulted my client, he was telling my client he was a gangster disciple. All I know is he assaulted my client, broke his jaw, and caused about $77,000 in medical bills, all while he was handcuffed." The FBI also revealed that they had recorded several phone conversations between Gums and the Georgia Gangster Disciples' chief enforcer, a man named Kevin Clayton, whom Gums had befriended shortly after joining the police force. According to the Department of Justice, during later calls, the chief enforcer remarked that he had Gangster Disciples police officers at his disposal. Among the information Gums provided to Clayton was intelligence about specific crimes under police investigation, and a warning to avoid a bar that law enforcement intended to raid. Gumbs was also accused of possessing cocaine in his patrol car, leading to his resignation from the DeKalb County Police Department following the complaint. Ultimately, he was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for racketeering conspiracy involving murder, followed by 5 years of supervised release. U.S. Attorney Byung Jae Pak commented on the case, stating, "His brazen disregard for his sworn duty as a police officer, his betrayal of the public's trust, and his disregard for human life warrant the significant sentence he received." Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed exploring these intriguing cold cases with me. If you found the video fascinating, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to Cold Case Mystique for more deep dives into cold case investigations. Your support helps me bring you more compelling content. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any cases you'd like me to cover next. See you in the next video. And remember, the search for truth never stops.